Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to introduce you all to Professor Brian Becker. How's it going, Brian?
It's good, Dave. Thanks for having me on here.
Yeah, it's an honor. I've really appreciated the work that you do. You're one of the few professors in the world today who takes the internet seriously.
Yeah, well, I find that there's spaces for conversation that can only really be had here. There are, as much as higher education is sort of promoted as a as a place of open dialogue and willingness to push the boundaries, there's a strong conservative element that limits that conversation within the university structure. So I'm very excited to explore this avenue of YouTube and other online social media platforms to get ideas out there.
Yeah, are you familiar with Samuel Loncar by any chance?
No, I'm not.
He teaches at Yale. He's younger. He wrote a dissertation on being in time, and he does really interesting videos about Plato and Aristotle and various thinkers outside of the phenomenological tradition. And he talks about philosophy as a kind of self psychotherapy or something. And so it's I really appreciate his general approach. But like you, he's basically, his mindset is, yeah, if I'm being paid to do this within an institution, and I can also put it out on the internet, there's something freer that about what you're able to do on the internet. But then more importantly, you're making this available to people who just don't have the access. And so some good examples. You've had a conversation with the K Voy boys. They are one half of the Young Jijikians. They just changed their name to the Vanishing Mediators. And I think uh, I think the for us, like, we all found out about you because Michael Downs, a warehouse worker in Raytown, Missouri, is just a really big fan of your work and has been learning a lot of, he got it between McGowan and your work. Like, there's really no better crash course from actual professors into Lacan. But I guess the reason that I'm so fascinated by your work is that, it's almost like you're doing what Samuel Loncar is doing, but you're also doing what Todd McGowan is doing. You have a foot in both the academic world and the online world, and then you also have a foot in the world of psychoanalysis and phenomenology. And so, our first conversation, I just had all kinds of questions for you about Husserl, intentionality, categorical intuition, the original a priori, these basic things that Heidegger thinks are like the most essential discoveries from the last 100 years of philosophy that make it possible to even do philosophy. He thinks it's not even possible to do philosophy without these fundamental contributions and discoveries on the part of phenomenology. But of course, intentionality, as he says, was already kind of around for Aristotle. They had some kind of a pre-theoretical consciousness of intentionality, as did the scholastics. But it's through Brentano that modernity becomes aware of intentionality. And then Husserl really brings it together and formalizes it and tries to approach the psyche and psychology in a more scientific attitude that rids it of scientism. And that's kind of what my understanding of it is. But I'm hoping that what you could do is just help us understand how intentionality is an intervention in the history of philosophy, how it is a critique of scientism, and more importantly, its influence on Heidegger and Lacan, two very significant figures for this channel. But first, I'm just wondering, like, could you kind of, in your own words, tell, yeah, what is intentionality? How does it work? What
Yeah.
is that? Why does it matter?
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. And thank you for all that introduction. And um, it's been great to try to bring together psychoanalysis and phenomenology. And that's been a sort of a centerpiece of my work. So I look forward to maybe thinking through that, especially as we get to intentionality as it might relate to Freud and Lacan. Um, so for me, intentionality, if I want to go back there is inklings of that in Aristotle. I find that perhaps even a bigger influence or a link between the Greek thought and scholastic thought is Augustine. Augustine had a tripartite theory of the mind that corresponded with the Trinity, with the three persons of God, and those three included memory, intellect, and will. And another way of thinking about will is love has been one way of he's thought of it, but also intentio, which is sort of the Latin origin of the word intentionality. And interestingly, intentio was meant to be sort of correspond to the Holy Spirit. Each of the three parts of the mind corresponded with the three parts of the Trinity. And intentio corresponded with the Holy Spirit. And in theology, the Holy Spirit is sort of the glue, the relational glue that binds together Father and Son. And so why I start with that is because I think that's a helpful metaphor for thinking about how Husserl in particular, the Brentano somewhat, but Husserl thinks of intentionality as a glue that binds together subject and object in an indissociable way. So that is sort of a sort of starting point. And then as you mentioned, Brentano really sort of reintroduces the topic to a modern audience. And probably through Augustine, I think he had a strong interest in scholastic theology as well. And so he introduces the idea, and it has a lot of overlap and certainly a lot of influence with Husserl. But at least from Husserl's perspective, Brentano maintains a kind of naturalistic, dualistic attitude towards subject and object, where it seems as though intentionality refers specifically to the acts of consciousness themselves. And in fact, consciousness was defined as the totality of these mental acts, and that there can be a consciousness toward the object, and then there's a self-consciousness of one's consciousness toward the object. So a reflective sort of attitude towards one's consciousness. And so intentionality consisted of those components. And interestingly, he rejects any idea of the unconscious. The only sort of way the unconscious makes sense to him is there are certain levels of intensity of these mental acts and the intensity of the object presentations to these mental acts. And the unconscious for him is just merely a low intensity presentation and act. We'll see if we think about how this influences Freud and Husserl, both of whom students of Brentano, and perhaps both of them influenced in a way in which they tried to maybe extend some of his thought, but also were reacting against it. So that's
they were reacting against Brentano.
At least to start against Brentano in certain ways, but in different ways. Yeah, we're working against Brentano. Freud rejecting the idea of that there is no unconscious, that he thought that he could make the case that there is, and interestingly, perhaps even tries to extend the idea of intentionality for there to be unconscious, a sort of unconscious intentionality, and he sort of makes this somewhat explicit in the psychopathology of everyday life, where he uses the word intentionality seemingly under the influence of Brentano, but then tries to think about it in terms of the unconscious.
Okay.
Yeah. So and then Husserl, of course, he rejects the idea that intentionality refers purely to mental acts, but is like I mentioned about the intentio and Augustine, it's the glue that brings together the mental acts with the mental content.
The mental acts and the mental content. Can we use a couple of concrete examples of mental acts and mental content, and then why we need to even think about glue?
Hmm. Yeah. So when I am relating to, for example, my let's see here, my microphone right here, for example, I could have an attitude, or I can be looking at, I'm perceiving the microphone, right? There's a mental act going on, and then there's the microphone as perceived, and so there's a relationship between the two that um, binds them, and the intentionality is what links them together. So intentionality includes the act of perceiving and the content of the perceived. And this is to say why this is important is, if we have to think about the context in which this was being thought through, where this is coming in the aftermath of Descartes and especially Kant. And there's these philosophical problems concerning the relationship between subject and object. This might seem like a passe problem to many thinkers today, but it was, and in some ways continues to be, a pervasive issue, especially if you think about how the natural sciences uh, consider philosophically the relationship between subject and object. It still is permeated with a kind of dualism. So the idea is that I have these maybe intrinsic capacities to know, and I can deploy the scientific method to suspend any particularity about myself, so I can access what's outside my head, which is the objective world out there, which I can study in a relatively controlled manner. And that work, there's a certain practicality to that. But what Husserl says is that all of that whole procedure of science depends upon a more fundamental relationship with the world, in which objects are not presented as independent from my consciousness, but they are given to me as perceived, as wanted, as desired, right? So there's no such thing as this pure access to the objective world outside of this relationship of intentionality. So really, and so I can talk about, for example, scientific facts, and certainly Husserl was not rejecting science, but the questions I ask, the kind of ways I engage in my scientific inquiries, is informed by a prior relationship and prior embeddedness with the world that is always already there. And so what Husserl is interested in is suspending the issue of the objective world independent of consciousness, bracketing all that, bracketing whether things out there truly exist, and just getting at the way in which things present themselves to me, and how those presentations get elicited in relationship to my attitudes or approach to those things. And so it's really about reestablishing the intimate relationship between the two.
Right, and this is part of like the a more scientific effort to rid psychology and philosophy of scientism. And what I mean by that is like to not borrow hand-me-down concepts from other niche fields that consciousness has opened up in inquiry, and then take those concepts as metaphors that are then just projected into the psyche, right? And instead to found psychology philosophically on its own contents, really, but not just its contents in this purely descriptive way. Part of the issue with talking about appearances, right, is people will think, oh, well, phenomenology is just describing things. Well, I mean, then everybody's always doing that, right? But it tries to become a discipline and a method, and really a practice, for living the examined life, for learning how to bracket out presuppositions and think about what we see after we've done that. But more importantly, not just what do we see, but, and I was talking about this with Andrew and Nick last night, it's more about deducing from the way things do reveal themselves, deducing from the way that things are revealed, not things about those things, and not things about ourselves as subjects alone, but specifically, what can we deduce about the relationship between subject and object structurally, right? What structures can we deduce from the way that things appear? So to get at something deeper, and so this gets us to the kind of question, I guess, I think this was a question, we talked about this a little bit last night in the conversation about being in time when we were talking about phenomenology. This idea that, like, Lacan, he works through the three major phases of the Borremian, he works through the three stages of the Borremian knot, the three registers of the Borremian knot through the three phases of his career, right? There's the imaginary period, the symbolic period, and the real period. And, each prior period is sublated into the next. So it's never like they're in isolation from one another, but it's a point of change in emphasis. And in that sense, he's sort of doing his own bracketing. But the accusation from psychoanalysis, especially Lacanian psychoanalysis that doesn't think it has to take phenomenology seriously, tends to be, it's just in the imaginary. And I wonder what you think of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess it's good to start off that Lacan, early on in his career, seems to be much more indebted explicitly to phenomenology. In fact, his dissertation on which was on psychosis and a case study of someone named Amy, he wanted to develop what he called a phenomenology of personality, in which he wanted to explore some of the intentional functions, do a sort of a genetic study, a study of the unfolding of intentional functions as they relate to the social human relationships and the social nature of the individual, of the human person. So that was sort of where he got his start, and certainly, and I do think there's probably some influence from Brentano to Freud to Lacan, in the sense that Freud picked up the idea of a kind of intentionality that's unconscious, sort of a series of mental acts that sometimes even contradict the conscious intentionality. And that idea, although I've never seen really formulated by Lacan, seems to permeate the psychoanalytic tradition. But there's a lot of problems that are embedded in, at least Lacan sees, between the relationship of psychoanalysis and the phenomenology developed by Husserl. So, okay. Husserl, for example, is very much focused on the unity of experience, right? So there is very much a integrated unit of analysis, which is the ego, which is consciousness, even though this is not reducible to just inner acts, but also to the contents that are out there in the world. The problem of the unified nature of all this is something that I think Lacan thinks is inaccessible to us, because there is this break in consciousness, because there's this split, and I think as he's trying to see that, as he's early on trying to do an analysis of phenomenological analysis of personality and looking at the social, he finds that in some ways the internalization of the social through the ego ideal is a sort of is a basis for it gives rise to what the ego is, in a sense, the ego that Husserl talks about. But because of this, because of the way in which the ego ideal is internalized, it makes it impossible for for oneself, for the image of oneself, to know where that comes from, to be able to engage in some sort of philosophical analysis about the origins of this. So I think all that to say is that I think Lacan sees some major problems with Husserl's way of doing phenomenology in light of psychoanalysis. That the two are not cannot be reconciled in any way that would be meaningful for him, at least as he continues on in his thinking. That doesn't mean that phenomenology as a whole is rejected by him. And I think, yes, the way you said about phenomenology being relegated to the level of the imaginary, I think does make a lot of sense. And every time he talks about Merleau-Ponty, for example, and his notion of phenomenology, it's always in the context of the imaginary. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a problem. This is my particular perspective, where I don't necessarily see the imaginary as the bad guy in Lacan's theory. That as much work as we do to break through the calcifications of imaginary identifications and fixations, we never leave the imaginary. That we always, when we're reflecting, we're always starting from the imaginary perspective, and we never get out of it. Even as we try to reflect on the symbolic, we always reflect on the symbolic from the position of the imaginary. We always reflect on the real from the position of the imaginary, even as those are giving rise to and shaping what our imaginary experiences are. Now, that's not something that a lot of Lacanians sort of how they talk about it, but I feel like there's a lot of attempts to get rid of or sort of say the imaginary is sort of the pathological dimension of the human person, and we need to sort of, and we kind of nowadays people quickly skip over that to look at what the symbolic is doing, the symbolic in relationship to the real. And I feel like that misses the point that you've never actually escaped the influence of the imaginary, and that it begins there. And so in that sense, you could return to Husserl's phenomenology by reducing things to the imaginary, and by seeing how this is the starting point for everything we begin with. But then you would have to go beyond that, beyond Husserl, to show how the imaginary itself, the ego itself, is constituted by forces external to it, that you can't just stay within consciousness. If that's what you do, then you're fundamental. There's a lot of problems with that.
So I'd like to ask a few questions then about the difference between Husserl and Freud's departures from Brentano, but then also Heidegger and Lacan's departures from Husserl. And obviously, you basically just set up the case for Lacan's departure or critique of Husserl. So then, my big question would be Heidegger's, right? And then we can work backwards and kind of bring it back around to Freud and Husserl with Brentano. Because for me, it's just always been kind of like, I know I have like this sense for what's going on, but when I read them, it's really hard to track, because they're all interpreted or translated into, it is an interpretation, but they're all translated into English, how I'm reading them, and they're translated by different people, and so it's like it's hard. It's like, okay, are we talking about the same things? And also, how charitable of a reader was each of them to the other, and how inspired are they by how much actual fidelity do they have to these original projects? These are all kind of like the big questions for me. But before we dive into that, just for a note of clarification for anybody who's watching, who's like, imaginary, what do you mean everything's imaginary? Like, well, how does it all start at the imaginary? I know it's like the language of the three registers can be confusing at first, so let's at least just kind of staple down what we mean by the imaginary, as in respect to the symbolic and the real. Would you basically say that the imaginary is not just things that you imagine, but also everything and how it appears?
Yeah, I think that's not a bad starting point. I think the imaginary, it has a relationship to consciousness, though you don't want to equate the two. It is also reflected in what we see in animals. So when we talk about animal nature, animal relationships, this seems to be part of what the imaginary is. It is the source of understanding and identifications and meaning. So, for example, right now I'm talking to you. I'm Brian Becker, right? I'm talking to Dave on Theory Underground. I have some beliefs about what I think that means about my own name and what you and who you are and who you're about. And I think I'm talking to you right now, and I think
so.
I'm the one choosing the words I'm saying, and that there's a meaning behind them that I'm intending. All of that is imaginary. Okay. And so it is the world of experience, really. Experience that pretends it's unmediated often, that it doesn't, that there's no intersecting invisible structures or phenomena that are guiding this process in ways that deviate from, I'm one subject talking to another subject, and with meanings behind it.
Right, which is we atomize individuals into personalities that express identities or belong to identity categories, and that's about the extent of the, I guess, normie consciousness of the default setting that we operate in. There with things like identity politics and social justice, people have a window or a doorway into beginning to think a little bit more about symbolic relations, but it usually doesn't go very deep. It's usually kind of just like, oh, who gets to speak, versus actually thinking about like things at a more elaborate or sophisticated level of, structurally what's going on at the level of, the reproduction of society on a day-to-day basis, and our functions in that reproduction, in both terms of production and ideology, right? And so this is, and that's kind of the more Marxist approach. And so that's kind of, especially for the Marxist Lacanians, that's going to be that, of course, there will be this emphasis on the symbolic and how it relates to the real. But your point is basically that without really interrogating what we take for granted at the level of appearances in a rigorous manner, we almost like stay inside of Plato's cave, right? Like you're not getting out of the first stage of appearances if you've not done a phenomenological deconstruction of appearance itself. Would you agree to that?
I would say there's a lot of truth to that. I would say that I would almost reverse if it was taking the metaphor, I almost reverse the relationship where the brightness of the light of that shining, giving us this clear access to things, is the imaginary, and going into the darkness of the cave is actually the direction we need to go. We are the illusion is that we believe we're seeing truth for what it truly is, and maybe that's what you're doing when you're seeing the shadows on the wall. But we do have to, the metaphor works better in my mind from a psychoanalytic perspective if we reverse the directionality of where we're going, where we got to see how it is that we construct these shadows in the first place, and dig deep. The one thing I want to go back to is, I think you, in talking about identity politics and other kinds of different ways of thinking about the imaginary, I think is useful here, because there is the imaginary idea of unity, wholeness, that I picture myself, right? But, and as we see, what Lacan shows is that there's that the unity of the imaginary is very tenuous, and there's a fundamental fragmentation that's undergirding it that can come apart at any point. We can see this in dreams, and I think in seminar 2, Lacan does a good analysis of Irma's injection and how there's this decomposition of the imaginary. What I think you see in some popularized forms of maybe identity politics or what sometimes goes under the word postmodernism, is this recognition of the fragmentation and the celebration of it. And so you see it's a lot of forms of social constructionism, like, for example, Kenneth Gergen, who's a psychologist, who talks a lot about the multiplicity of selves, the saturated self and the multiple self, and wants to celebrate this as an achievement of our contemporary scene. And to me, what I hear in this is not a recognition of the symbolic, which has a universal component to it, actually, but a recognition of the decomposition and the inherent fragmentation of the imaginary, and then a seeking to want to recognize a recognition of the fragmentation. So here's some fragments that aren't recognized. Here's some that are. We want to celebrate the fragmentation, and I identify with a particular fragment of this situation. And so I think that's it. For me, it's a good illustration how the imaginary is still rich with analysis in terms of the different ways we hold it, and how it expresses itself in different groups.
So this idea of wholeness and unity, would you say that that's part of the ideology of average everydayness, the sort of what we take for granted at the level of appearances, and that this is why you're saying that it's almost like the reversal of Plato's cave? It's like everyone always feels like when they go outside, when they go to work, when they go to the grocery store, they go to the park, oh, I've left the shadows, I'm in the real world now, right? And I'm having genuine, authentic encounters with other people, and other people are being authentically themselves, and this is the sort of unified wholeness ideal, yeah. And you're saying that relates to the identity politics exactly how again? I just want to hear it in another way, perhaps.
Because when we recognize, because there is an attempt to want to, a standard way of thinking about things is looking at them in integrated, holistic ways. That we are all the same underneath. We have a sense of what our humanity is and what it means to be human, and these are imaginary constructions, and that there is but if you dig just below the surface of our imaginary constructions, we find that they're fragmented. So if you take a deconstructivist attitude toward our imaginary, you can pick apart the inconsistencies and the fragmentations that are always there.
Right.
And so that's sort of what I'm saying, is that there's an attempt to celebrate the fragmentation of this thing we call the imaginary, that is at least traditionally been thought of as this providing us the sense of a predictable, unified experience of reality. That there's a meaning to life, that there is that I have a soul or an identity, that you have one too, and even if you think differently than me, as long as I recognize you as human, I see that you have certain similarities as I do inherently, and that there's this emphasis on that. And really in the rise of the post-structuralist, postmodern thought is an attempt to poke holes into that framework, and you can see a politics. I think you can see a politics that sort of corresponds with that philosophical movement.
Yeah, and this is kind of like one of the contradictions within movements for social justice, as well as movements that say, oh, well, those aren't really for social justice, those are performative. And so like the more anti-woke tendencies on the left, or even the right sometimes, it seems like there's a contradiction on both sides between one that says, no, you're a singular whole individual, you're not your identity group category, you're part of humanity in this sort of holistic sense that doesn't see difference, right? And so that one, that can like erase obviously like a person where they're coming from, as opposed to, oh no, you are authentically and holistically this identity group category, you're the representative of that, and you're an unsplit subject able to speak on behalf of everybody else in this unsplit grouping, right? So it seems like both sides have an issue between people who've kind of come to a consciousness of the split, as opposed to people who are that's not something that they've really worked through yet.
Yeah, I mean, I just was listening to Y Theory this morning. You know, they had a recent discussion on Twitter, right? And why the left celebrates Twitter as being a voice of, in some ways it celebrates the diversity of voices. It gets people out. It gives people ability to express themselves and get their message out there. And the idea is that there is this sort of space of multiplicity that we can sort of uphold. And up until recently, there were a lot on the left who sort of celebrated Twitter as that sort of thing, not recognizing, as I think the Y Theory points out really nicely, is how there's a form to this content. There's a structure that's guiding this process of multiplicity, as there is with the idea of a unified voice of the conservative movement. And so I think there's in that example is a good way of thinking that both groups are still operating at the imaginary, rather than and focused on content. And that's a good way of thinking about it. Imaginary is content, right? Symbolic is form. And what we often, and we see different ways in which groups relate to the content and celebrate it or reject it because it's a threat to the traditions that we hold dear, that unify us.
I'm gonna have to check out that conversation. Yeah, we had Todd on yesterday to do a sort of tribute conversation that we did about Michael Downs and the Dangerous Maybe blog, because Mikey can't attend this 2-day marathon and he can't attend the LAC conference, which is kicking off today. So I'm guessing you're not attending either.
No, unfortunately, I'm not there.
Hopefully we can all make it to the next one, but no, Mikey's obviously just destined to work himself to death, unless hopefully we can make the impossible possible. And so that's what the hashtag Free Mikey campaign has been about. And so we brought on Todd to talk about that. And I didn't even realize, like, he actually organizes the whole thing, like the whole LAC conference. And so hats off to him for coming on stream in the middle of organizing a conference. But so you're saying he and Ryan had this whole conversation about Twitter and how the Twitter had been celebrated as a space of diversity, but the people representing groups in the discourse were always assuming this holistic kind of unified side in the duopoly of the culture war that they were representing or speaking on behalf of or following, right? And they were basically trying to shatter that illusion.
Well, there was a part of it that they were emphasizing that the right is sort of a sort of, this is where I disagreed with them somewhat, that the right is sort of the celebration of the particular, of the multiple in a sense, and that the left is sort of representative of this attempt at the universal, but now recognizing that in celebrating Twitter, they are inadvertently sort of reinforcing the right and the sort of capitalist machine that is undergirding it. So I think I was confused by that point in the show, because for me, I've always seen the left as the sort of origin of the attempt at look at multiplicity as of celebrating fragmentation and difference, and the right as being, at least since while I was growing up, was always the voice of promoting the unity, even if it was fundamentally based in particularist ideologies. It was always this attempt to suggest the universal, to speak to the universal. And then what happened is the right co-opted that, and then has now, in a sense, is now currently expressing this sort of this attitude, or that sort of multiplicity and celebration of particularity against what is now, interestingly, the left call for unity and universality. So I think there's a very interesting reversal, and maybe they were speaking to the current context, whereas I was sort of looking at it from a historical perspective.
But
either way,
fascinating. No, yeah. By either way, we should get back to kind of there's a sort of backlog of questions we're going to get to here that were already kind of brought up, but being proper Žižekians, we can't be dialectical without trying to take contradictions and flesh them out and bring them to light, and irreconcilable as they might be. So I at least want to, maybe there's this 2-day marathon is a sort of like, here's a portal, here's a portal, here's a portal. These are portals into conversations and lines of thought and fields of discourse. And so there's a lot of stuff opening over the last 17 hours of streaming for this. And like one of those was the contradiction between Nina Power and Daniel Tutt. One of those is the potential the contradiction between Christine Louis Soli and the Solitariat. And these are all related to various issues that are ones that you can't really even talk about in most existing institutions, but that regular people want to think about, and anybody who's got a sense of intellectual integrity and wants to try to understand the world is going to want to be able to talk about. And so in part, Theory Underground does hope to be able to kind of make some of those things possible. So this disagreement then that you're proposing with Todd, this is fascinating to me, because I did read his book Enjoyment, Right and Left, and he definitely has a historical case to be made. I think that the thing I would like to do is leave it to him to clarify this. I'd love to bring you both into conversation someday. That would be like a dream come true. Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Cool. Well, for now, I'll just say that, like, I think that there's the struggle for recognition starts out as a struggle to be included, to stop being excluded on the basis of identity, to stop being excluded on the basis of laws that force people into prison if their identity is gay, if their identity, or, oh, you can't drink from this water fountain or live in this neighborhood if you're black. So it starts with as W.E.B. Du Bois says, the struggle to abolish the color line. But then once those gains are achieved in the legal system, then the institutionalized representation of these groups continue on, need funding, and become advocates for the return of the color line by having that enshrined in law. So it starts out as a call to be included in the universal. And then once in the universal, it becomes, no, let's actually make law particularist, right?
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm doing Todd justice. I'll definitely send him this clip and be like, Todd, watch this, and let me know what you think. But I think that's basically where he's coming from.
I would agree. I mean, I would agree with. Yes, if the idea that there is this that the original call, that this original impetus to inclusion, that if you go back far enough, is sort of the starting point, and then you have this, as you talk about, the graining in law, this particularity that actually reestablishes the segregations. Makes a lot of sense to me. I think where my thinking or my comments on this are more philosophical in my thinking, where I see, for example, individuals like Derrida, Deleuze, others who are sort of on the side of the multiple, who want to celebrate multiplicity as a fundamental starting point, and that this was something that was strongly reacted to in the more conservative American philosophy scene, who didn't like this idea of this kind of what seemed to them to be incoherent chaos and mysticism sort of way of thinking. Well, and so I go ahead.
My background, it would be more Emmanuel Levinas, but he's exactly the same in that. Well, Derrida is a Levinasian in his ethics, right? And so this is the ethics of the other, the radically singular, irreducible other that is an infinity that escapes our totalizations, right? And so it's like, totality, infinity, being in time, Das Kapital. That's the three seminal priority texts that I'm teaching in the first year and a half of Theory Underground. And so I just had to kind of get the plug for Emmanuel Levinas in there. He's kind of the vanishing mediator as well, because he's the one who first translated Husserl into French in the first place. So, anyway,
he translated the Cartesian Meditations. He translated it into French, and then it got translated into English from there.
Exactly. I visited his grave in France in November.
Nice.
It was I did like a graveside lecture that hasn't been published yet, but I did a whole tour of Europe, and I was only able to get to a few people because we had to make decisions. And so it's kind of crazy making a decision to see Levinas and not be able to see Sartre, not be able to see Simone de Beauvoir. So anyway, that's why I thought I would bring him in here. But I think that there's a case to be made that Levinas, Deleuze, and Derrida, as well as these other thinkers of difference, are all in their own singular, irreducible ways dealing with seeing the institutionalization that Todd is talking about, right? And this idea that X, Y, or Z representative speaks for the whole. Like we saw this in Bernie versus Biden when it came to South Carolina, and everybody referred to Clyburn and Senator Clyburn and his position endorsement for Biden. They saw that as the definitive conclusion that the Black community likes Biden, and it's like, this is erasing Jesse Jackson. This is erasing Nina Turner. This is erasing Killer Mike, Cornel West, right? So it was like, a way of gaslighting everybody about, oh, there's this unified whole, and Clyburn speaks for it. And so it's weird then how, there's a contradiction here, and it feels like it would be fruitful to kind of bring you and Todd together, but also for you to be drawing on these thinkers, and then maybe we can take our historical accounts and try to see what comes of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it might be just where you draw the line historically and what you mean by these terms, right? That can also be part of the disagreement. Could be more semantic than anything. But it'd be a great conversation, and would look forward to that and learning from Todd, because I have a lot of respect for his thought and his body of work.
Like I said, I see you both as the the true renegade academics, in a sense. Like, you've both got your feet in these worlds. You're making this accessible to everybody, and it's one of the coolest things that has come about in the last 10 years. So bringing it back around, though, are there any questions or threads that come to, because I have my notes and I can bring them up, but is there anything that you want to start off with, bringing it back around to these questions?
Yeah, so I think one thing I haven't really connected the dots yet is with Husserl and Heidegger, and what Heidegger does with intentionality. Is that something you want to talk to?
Well, so we basically talked about Lacan's critique of Husserl is that he doesn't get out of the imaginary. He's not really able to get into the symbolic. There are like these serious limitations. Then we also critique Lacanians who think they don't need phenomenology because they think they can just kind of skip the deconstruction of immediacy. So I guess my question then, a segue into this one, would be, is that kind of where Heidegger's coming from? Does he also think that? And if not, then what's his major departure?
I think it would be different if we talked about early versus late Heidegger here. I focus on early Heidegger because that's I'm more knowledgeable about that phase. And I think what Heidegger does with Husserl, who in many ways his thought is a continuation of Husserl's, but I think he sees it as a radicalization of it. And even though the word intentionality doesn't come up a lot, the word care does. And care is not the same as intentionality, but it functions somewhat similarly, except that it is more primordial than intentionality. So in care, there is this directedness towards things, a directedness toward beings in the world, and there's different ways in which we take care of things, or we have concern for others, and we, through this process, bring into actuality certain possibilities. And of course, the most fundamental mode of care is care toward the ultimate possibility, which is one's death. Right. But it's the kind of care that is involved with relating to one's death is one that doesn't actually make it actual, but actually. So when you bring something from possibility to actuality, you reduce possibility in most things you do. But when it comes to taking care and being ahead of oneself toward death, you actually enlarge possibility itself. You magnify it and in your life, in the life of Dasein. So I think this care is the totality of Dasein and its being in the world. So in many ways, you can see how it has this sort of similar structure to intentionality, except that care is pre-reflective first off. So whereas for Husserl, you had to go through a method of bracketing and reduction to arrive at pure consciousness, to describe and do a taxonomy of the various intentional acts and the relationship to content. For Heidegger, we're always already involved in the world, and so and another way of saying that we always already care about our being, and so this status of care is more fundamental than intentionality, which is sort of a derivative way of looking at the world. It would be more turning the world present to hand rather than ready to hand. And it's right. So that derivative mode of being is Heidegger is trying to get at something even more fundamental than that. And so that's how I conceive of their relationship. And in fact, in general, the way you see a lot of philosophers relate to their those who precede them, is they often don't outright reject them. What they're always saying is that you see this a lot of phenomenology, and I'm trying to get at something more primordial, more fundamental, not in terms of not in terms of like literal time or in terms of causality, but logically prior. Like that's something that has to be there in order for you to then do this. So intentionality presupposes care, and that's why Heidegger goes into this deeper place. And so that's how I think of the relationship between the two, or at least the Heidegger of being and time.
And are you using care and comportment synonymously here?
I would say comportment is a way of is a mode of care, a way of being in the world, often in reference to
readiness to hand,
taking care of things.
Okay.
What's that?
It's often in relation to readiness to hand.
I would say it's more of a readiness to hand.
Right.
I think Merleau-Ponty does a lot more with this than Heidegger. But yeah, I think that would be the way of thinking of it for Heidegger, at least in Being and Time.
Right. So like comportment, like that's kind of like the way you go about your day and the things that you do throughout your week, and circumspection, which is like your kind of awareness in that mode of comportment, is part of average everydayness. And so this is the point of departure for Heidegger, because he says like, okay, but we're not really thinking about we're trying to get to pure consciousness, but we're not really, what is the being of pure consciousness as opposed to the being of its objects and what the being of its intentionality? Well, what's the being of the being who's asking the question about all these kinds of beings? We have to inquire into the being of the being asking the questions before we can ever get to bigger questions about being themselves. Like because ultimately his big driving force is this question, what is being? People have lost that question. But first, we can't even talk about that because people aren't even really taking a step back from this split between the humanities and the natural sciences and saying, well, what is the being of the being for whose issue, or for whom being is an issue for it, right? So it's like, and so this starting from that point is like starting at the level of, okay, well, let's start describing how humans actually operate. How do they actually think? How do they go about things? But then doing deductions from this to get to care and being unto death and right?
The existentials.
Is this right so far?
Yeah, I would say that's correct. That you're arriving at the existentials, these sort of what are sort of like Husserl's categorical intuitions, except that they are again more fundamental. And one of the key things for Heidegger is doing this deduction without any reference to consciousness, any reference to subjectivity. Dasein is not a subject. Dasein is a being in the world. It is, you don't go internal with Heidegger. You're not looking at things like with Husserl, you get this feeling of you're looking at this sort of this virtual screen of integrated reality that you want to describe, and so you're almost looking at it from an inside perspective, whereas Heidegger really wants to look at things not as an internal subjective experience, but as an ontological reality, as an ontological fact of that presupposes our ability to have consciousness, of our ability to have subjectivity. And in a sense, this would make Lacan closer to Heidegger than to Husserl, because I think that movement of what precedes consciousness is a movement that has a good influence on Lacan.
Absolutely. Adam Mad in the chat just said, he's one of our moderators in the Zoom side as well. He said, by the way, Brian's channel is a profoundly useful resource. And then he shared the link. And honestly, I think it was because we were kind of in a hurry, switching gears. Things were kind of rushed getting set up. I didn't actually say that, Brian, that your channel is called Singularity as Sublimity, and that it's how we all know of you. And so, first of all, let me put it up on the screen. Thanks for sharing that, Adam. It's up on the screen now. And so that was perfect, though. That was really good. And so, yeah, getting out to those existentials, I used to kind of define, when I'm trying to explain what an existential is, I think I might have said this in my thesis, that an existential, really, like, Heidegger doesn't want to call it a category, but because of that, we can also just say it's an existential category. So there are, natural, like, the objects that exist in the mode of natural consciousness, or the kinds of objects that exist that we try to analyze scientifically, like, these are the, we can develop categories for thinking about them, and how we think about them, how they're represented to consciousness or whatever. Those are categories, though, that deal with rocks and trees and potentially animals. But as soon as you start taking the categories that we've used to develop to think about geological rock formations, for instance, and then you start applying that shit onto consciousness, it's like, okay, so we're doing some kind of a reductionism here. And so what he wants to do is completely say, all right, we're going to let the categories exist, but let's develop these existentials. But instead of calling them existential categories, I've been thinking, no, they're just existential structures of our being in the world, right? Is that, do you prefer that language, or do you have another way that you prefer to describe what an existential is as opposed to a natural category?
I think I'm fine with categories. I think he even sort of uses it on occasion. He talks about them as being a prioris. So he's except that these, again, a prioris are not mental. They're part of existence itself. I think, if taking a categorical intuition with Husserl, you're like, I'm gonna look at the mental content in light of my mental acts, and I'm going to find some fundamental features of the object. So always the example of the three-dimensional physical object, you can talk about its extension in space, and then no matter how I move it, what the technical word adumbrations, these outlines of the thing and perspectives, it's still, space is an essential component of this object of a pen. So there we have this sort of universal category we've just identified. Now let's look at it from Heidegger's perspective. Heidegger wants to take a step back. It's like, okay, what is making all that possible? Well, one is that I was thrown into a world. I'm in a world, that my facticity, right? That the fact I'm interested in even describing this suggests that I'm oriented toward a future, that I'm projecting possibilities that I want to actualize. And so that's another existential, right? So there's, and that I could even, why would I even want to describe this in the first place? Because I care, because I have some sort of concern or care for something that actually makes me want to describe its essential features. So everything I do from from Husserl's perspective is just capture within a wider lens. Just like Newtonian mechanics wasn't rejected for the Einstein theory of relativity, it was contextualized within a wider spectrum of thinking. And I see that kind of way of that movement you see in physics, you see, I think, in the movement from Husserl to Heidegger. Right.
This is why I think towards the end of chapter 2 of History of the Concept of Time, he says that he says in a lot of ways I am still a student of Husserl, or something along those lines that kind of gets at that basic. Maybe he doesn't quite put it in that way, but I do believe that's what he's getting at. But like all thinkers worth reading and rereading, he isn't just critiquing on the basis of, oh, I disagree with this and that and the other thing, and that's it. No, he wants to do an immanent critique, which is to say, taking most seriously the values, principles, and methodology of his master, and taking it to its logical conclusion, showing how this was a great first attempt, right? But also what he says is that Husserl has read some of my critiques, and we've been in dialogue, and he knows what I'm saying at this lecture, and so I'm not current with his thought. because he's still working on his project. And so, and that's ultimately the most interesting thing about thinking about the ways that Sartre, Emmanuel Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, they all, supersede Husserl, but he didn't stop existing. He was kind of living through it all, and these were his students, and he kept writing, he kept thinking, and so he I guess that's kind of my question then would be, what are so in the way that you're more familiar with early Heidegger, are you only really familiar with early Husserl, or are you able to have you really gone into like his later work, and can you kind of say how his work develops as a response to these kinds of critiques?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the Cartesian Meditations, I think, was written after Being in Time, I believe, and certainly even his early work, in like the logical investigations, he's making a lot of revisions and comments in light of Heidegger. But really, the Crisis, one of his final books that was published after he passed, really was an attempt to think his phenomenology broader and more of a contextualist approach to phenomenology. And so I think it's very hard to say Husserl thinks this when there's so many different Husserls across the periods of his career. He was every work is an introduction to phenomenology, but it's always done from a different vantage point. And in the Crisis, you see this attempt to take into account, I think, more seriously the notion of horizons and something that actually Heidegger picks up a lot on, the notion of horizon. And so I think you see that response. I'm not familiar enough to say specifically how he develops it there. I'd have to take a look at that work again.
For sure.
But we're always finding new stuff in Husserl, like in all the unpublished manuscripts, finding lots of very nuanced and developed ideas that diverge from the standard story of what Husserl thought.
Right.
Like, for example, in some of these manuscripts, you find some writings on this notion of drive intentionality, the idea that there was more recognition of a pre-conscious reality. I mean, he already has some of this in this idea of this pathogenesis and the idea of hyletic data, the sensory materiality of data and habits of the self that precede the emergence of consciousness. And he develops this a little bit more in his notion of drive intentionality. And certainly it was not the full-blown development of an unconscious, but it opened the door for more potential intersections with psychoanalysis than you would think, given the standard telling of Husserl in his most famous text.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I did not know that. And so that just means that he was at least thinking along these lines somewhat, that these lines that Freud's sort of departure or expansion pack on Brentano, right? The expansion pack being it's not all conscious, man. It's not all conscious. There's this preconscious element, and so obviously for Freud, he's exploring the frontier of the unconscious, and so he's still. And this, I feel like that's a natural segue into bringing it back around then to the Husserl and Freudian debt and then deviations from Brentano, right? So then I guess my basic question from earlier that I'd raised, hoping we'd get to it. Husserl versus Freud in relation to Brentano, do they keep the same, or do you think that they are inheriting the same inspiration, attitude, sort of attitude as far as like a methodological approach to psychical phenomenon? Do they all inherit that stuff but then go in different directions in other ways, or do they inherit different things?
Yeah. Well, first off, Brentano, I guess, was a very seductive professor. He really drew Freud in. Freud got convinced he wanted to do philosophy after studying a little bit with Brentano. Um, I think, and Husserl had similar experiences. But I think that they both reject different aspects of Brentano and go in different directions with it. I mean, think about Husserl is he's he's thinking about the logic and mathematics, and so some of his earliest work was on geometry. So he's very interested in in establishing the truth claims concerning mathematics early on. Whereas Freud's concerns are much more and related to the natural sciences, medicine, neurology. He ends up becoming, I think, a neurologist. And so wanting to take what Brentano developed or reacting to it and thinking about it in naturalistic terms rather than purely philosophical. So I think they both reject his formulation of intentionality, and seemingly both reject his view of the unconscious, though it's less explicit in Husserl. But then they go in what seems to be very different directions, under very different influences and different questions they're asking.
This is awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate that you're able to kind of speak to this, because the discovery on my part that Freud was also there, like maybe not shoulder to shoulder with Husserl, like maybe they weren't, going for coffee afterwards, or looking at each other's notes, but they were, I mean, yeah, they were kind of around in the same time, and they were influenced by the same professor. And psychoanalysis and phenomenology are so fundamental to Slavoj Žižek and the Slovenian circle, so fundamental to really any kind of push towards a more sophisticated theory of what it is to be a human in the world, what's going on in the world, and how we might want to change it. And so kind of to that end, in the beginning, I think I had kind of touched on the first thing I'd said was, philosophy of science and scientism, and like how is intentionality itself, just in Husserl, but also obviously in these other thinkers in their various ways, a fundamental intervention in the way that we think about science. Yeah, that's the main kind of question, is like, because I think that you said, like, today we take this subject object dichotomy a lot less seriously. We don't take a hard dualism so seriously, but also at the level of just how we act and tend to assume things, we do, though. Yeah. And at the level of science and its role in understanding, even though people know it develops specific tools for specific fields for understanding specific types of entities, there's still a lot of scientism, which is to say that people will take those singular tools for specific projects and then just totalize those into explaining everything, right? Mm-hmm. And so, maybe you could speak to the historical crisis of the European sciences that they're responding to, and how this carries forward to today.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like what Žižek says about, it doesn't really matter if you don't believe in money as a inherent value, or if you don't believe in I like the example of, you don't believe in Santa Claus. If your children, you act as if Santa Claus is real because you are expected to for your children, and you do go through the whole thing. So really there's no difference. It doesn't matter whether you believe in dualism or not. Most of us are dualists because we're living and breathing in science, which imbibes in this understanding. And so anytime there's an appeal to science as the arbiter of truth, and I've been a scientist, I've conducted scientific research before in my various lives, and I have a lot of good things to say about it. But it's not fundamental. There are limits to it, and it often doesn't recognize those limits, and it imputes this dualism into our thinking in ways that we don't recognize. So, and I think Husserl saw that. Husserl saw that there was this crisis in science, and here's the thing: is that because science has this philosophical problem that it doesn't recognize because it thinks it's not philosophical. It is vulnerable to being discredited in various ways, and I think we're seeing this right now, where scientists are no longer really taken seriously because you can point out the philosophical inadequacies and the biases and all those things that are involved in science, and for that reason, it's hard for many now to take seriously scientists, which is too bad because the truths they discover are still valid even if their philosophical methods or the philosophical foundation is faulty, as long as you keep it contained within the limits of what science can say. So I think Husserl is concerned about science. Of course, his meaning of science was broader than just the natural sciences, the empirical sciences, but I think he included that as wanting to rescue these fields by placing them on some firmer basis. And I think that problem that he faced then, the crisis of European science, is the sort of the fruition of that we're seeing today.
I guess the critical question I want to raise then is the one that people coming into this stream, because I do have Marxists on as well, and because Marx is an essential thinker for me, is going to be the question of materialism versus idealism, as well as folks who might be coming in who are more like, oh, they got into intellectual things because they watched Neil deGrasse Tyson on Joe Rogan, and like they understand that Neil deGrasse Tyson says that, as Adam Mad just shared in the chat, Neil deGrasse, quote, philosophy is useless and that's an objective fact, right? Stephen Hawking said something similar about nothing he's ever done relied on philosophy of science, or maybe that was Lawrence Krauss. They've both said negative things about philosophy, and I really can't blame them. I've been to a lot of philosophy conferences, and so I don't blame them for going there and being like, well, this is useless. But they're not engaging with the primary text themselves like Einstein was, right? Like Einstein was critical of Bertrand Russell for not being metaphysical enough, right? And I read a bunch of his private journal notes and stuff like that one time in a library. Just pulled it off the shelf and was reading, and there he was talking about how Bertrand Russell's he throws out Kant too quick. He doesn't take seriously enough philosophy in this like broader sense. So basically that's not so much materialism versus idealism, but it's kind of related because it's a bit more kind of rationalism versus empiricism, like these kind of classical debates that some people feel have been settled by the advances of the sciences. And so I don't know if you'll want to deal with them both at the same time or kind of separately, but it's one of the things that I'm always wondering about. So if you can shed any illumination on that, that would be awesome.
So shed light on, like, say, the Marxist critique of idealism that's in phenomenology, and how that is that the question specifically?
Well, for that question, then I should add, like Lukács in The Destruction of Reason thinks that these are all fundamentally irrational, petty bourgeois or bourgeois in general, reflective ideologies that have no real interest in world change and don't think about the productive base in society that sets the parameters for the superstructure, ideology, the stuff that we take for granted when we just go about our normal lives, right? And so this kind of material emphasis is one that has, through people like Lukács today, through people like Daniel Tutt at Zero Books, or Chris Catrone at Platypus Affiliated Society, they think that these are they think phenomenology and psychoanalysis are derivative, mostly idealist, petty bourgeois tendencies. And yeah,
I think I would agree with them in part. I mean, I think there's these fields definitely have that tendency to become idealist. And Husserl claimed himself as an idealist, and that was his most critiqued, as usually his most critiqued facet. I think it's not so neat of a division in some thinkers when you think about idealism versus the realism or the materialist perspective. I think there's been movements in both phenomenology and we've seen in psychoanalysis a materialist move to show how we start off. There is this materialism that's sort of a base, and the philosophizing tries to start from that point. But if the issue is, I don't think that most of these people are thinking that theory itself is problematic, but more so the mode of theorizing, that it's not grounded in a materialism. But I guess the one thing I would say to this issue is that I would want to respect the dialectical relationship between thinking and action, theoria and praxis, right?
Yeah.
That if you cut those off from each other, then you're in trouble. you're going to undermine your own aims ultimately, and so a praxis without reflective theory is going to repeat the ideologies that it thinks is resisting, and theories that do not see themselves grounded in some kind of materialist way of thinking will often be their own forms of ideology. So rather than seeing them at odds, I see them in a dialectical tension. But that also means sometimes you can't always address. You have to sometimes sort of bracket one to look at another. And it's not just you have to look at both at the same time, or and you do have to understand that. I think I'm a very big believer in an appreciation and familiarity with the history of thought. Because what you see is that a lot of times people are creating these theories or promoting perspectives that have been already put out there in the history of philosophy, but because we're so present oriented, we don't really recognize the context in which these thoughts emerge. And it can so if it comes to political action and revolutionary change, I think those movements are enlivened by a more reflective stance, a more critical stance towards themselves, towards the movement. And so I guess that would be a sort of tentative sort of way of thinking about it. That's not going to satisfy any Marxists who reject psychoanalysis and philosophy in general, but that would be my approach to it.
Yeah, my tendency is to say I don't want to satisfy or generally try to orchestrate everything, assuming an audience of people who don't see the value of philosophy. But what is quite common is that someone coming into it from that background still has this oversimplified worldview Marxist big other that they're trying to they want to be able to still answer to it on behalf of
Mm-hmm.
their interest in philosophy. So they're interested in philosophy, but this big other, so that it's never like reaching out to me and saying, Dave, just like, why do you do this? I think that this person's a petty bourgeois idealist. It's always like, people say, and people aren't confused, people aren't convinced, and
Mm-hmm.
here's some articles that some people made somewhere, and like it's like, I those articles are written for a predetermined marketing demographic of people whose identities are curated around being subscribers to this specific hashtag or whatever. And for me, it's like I hope that we will always be able to bring in people who come from this background, but at the same time, I said it yesterday, I want to have some token worldview Marxists. I don't want to have I don't want to have be overrepresented by anybody from any like hardline ideology. It's like I like the ideological diversity. And so as far as the young atheist, or the new atheist, I should say, that was a slip. The new atheist, as far as the new atheists, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, even to some degree Hawkins, Hitchens, whatever, your answer would be the same, or might it be something a little different for them?
Well, my response to that perspective is to be more. I would ask them to be more scientific, to be more consistent within their own methods, because they're constantly violating the scientific method and the limits of science by saying the things they say, by turning it into a worldview, a philosophical system, and so that would be one thing is I want them, I want the scientists to be more scientific. And then the other thing is, and this would never go well with them, but if you want to, I don't know, if you want to reduce truth to facts, right, to empirical facts, there are the example that I often would think of when I watch these things, I was like, what would I say? It's like for example, when I'm in a relationship with my wife, I was first dating her. At some point, I didn't know if we were gonna get married. I didn't know if she loved me. I didn't know. I didn't. We were learning that, right? One thing I had to do to discover that truth was to, in a sense, to make the Kierkegaardian leap of faith, to proclaim love, to be able to discover what is lovable. That there was a truth there that had more meaning in my life than a lot of other things that I've encountered, that I cannot simply reduce to the empirical sciences. And they might be said, that's fine, that's not truth, that's just subjective, good old fashioned love, and that's fine. But to me, that is central to our human experience, and I operate out of that world, and I approach data from that world in which I love and I hate, and truth reveals itself to me in all sorts of ways that cannot be accessible through empirical measurement. And I'm living and imbibing in that world, and then I come to data from that, and I can't there's no way you can truly suspend all that. So I think there are truths that have to be recognized that are so central that we that we that we can't reduce to those things. And again, I don't think that would go over well, but that's an example for me of the limits of science and the question of truth. You can also apply it to literature, right? So I mean, there are truths in literature that, and the ways of arriving at and a lot of this is questions of meaning, right? And this is where science thinks they can go from facts to meaning, and in this sort of nice, neat way. Like, it's like when I discovered the universe is so infinite, and that my cells will be eternal. They'll be there for billions of years, and I get some consolidation out of that. Like, I feel warm and fuzzy inside. And I was like, what the? Why the hell would you? What does the one have to do with the other? Like, why do why? How are you deriving that meaning out of that data of physics? And so it's always a strange thing to see scientists try to invent narratives of meaningful narratives out of the data in ways that are quite creative, but demonstrates the limits of their methods.
Do you think that this is kind of a it seems like it's ideology in a sense, right? And
Mhm.
it seems like a lot of philosophical positions, determinism versus free will,
Mhm.
materialism versus idealism, empiricism versus rationalism, are often like rooted in a very strong desire for it to be a certain way. Like
Mhm.
For Sam Harris, uh, he really needs determinism to be true. Psychologically speaking, this guy is really trying to hold it together, and things will only he can only really hold it together if the universe is like a big clock. Like
Mhm.
it comes through in his affect, even with his spiritual turn about meditation and waking up and being mindful. And but it all seems it seems if you read his book about determinism through that mindfulness kind of like his therapism approach, it's like, yeah, it's all been copeology for him, right? It's
Mhm.
ideology to help him cope with a terrifying universe with a lot of unknowns and a lot of we would say room for radical freedom created by
Yeah.
the split in subjectivity, created by the split between our rational ego and drive.
Yeah, and I think that's where I find something useful in listening to him or other thinkers, and because there's a truth there that's being revealed beneath their words, right? It's like this is where yeah, you look for the symbolic, you look for the literal language and try to bypass the meanings of what they intend to say, and you get at this deeper structure that's underneath it, that's very fascinating and very. Um, I think gives us and sort of access to something even truer than what they're actually saying. And so I can appreciate it for their accidental stumbling upon a deep, a profound truth that they're not intending to communicate, but they are. And so I think it's a good example. And we're all doing. I mean, this is where like I we're all doing this. I have my own ideologies and I have my own copologies, right? And I try to be reflective towards them. I try to be dialectical with them and engaging them with other ways of thinking and questioning and critique. But at the end of the day, we are all still fundamentally in the imaginary, and we operate in a world where, you know, in the openness and indeterminateness of thought, it ultimately does collapse into action and to activity, and that action and activity is surrounded by a halo of imaginary constructions and meanings that we have to rely on to get by. And again, I don't even think that means they're false or true. I don't think those categories mean a lot. They have to see how they do function for us, but they're inevitable. This is why I always think the imaginary is inescapable. But we also have to find a way of recognizing that we are caught up in imaginary identifications, whether and imaginary narratives, right? Whether it's this narrative based in science, based in religion, based on Marxism, and try to see how that is functioning for us and how that is functioning in relationship to other ideologies, other symbolic networks that are at play within the larger societal context we find ourselves in.
That seems to me like a perfect quilting point, really, for the whole conversation, because I had started out by saying it's about a scientific attitude that is against scientism. And really, you've hit on so much. You've brought so much together. And I've got your channel back up here, and we'll keep it up for the duration of the conversation. People, really, I hope that you go subscribe. I will share the link in the chat. And then I guess my final question is I'll never have a final question. But for now, I'd originally said we would talk for 45 minutes and then go to Q&A. Instead, I think we talked for probably an hour and a half. So I'm at this point now where it's like I feel obligated to open the door here so you can get back to your life. But also, there are a couple of people on the Zoom chat side here. I think we've got Adam and Nance. They've been moderators in the live chat, so they've been following any conversation in there, and they can relay questions if you have time to hear any.
I do. I have a lecture prep I have to do for a class at 1:15, but I can stay for another 15, 20 minutes to address some of the questions.
That's awesome. Fantastic. Okay, Adam, Nance, if you're both there, go ahead and reveal yourselves, introduce yourselves, and yeah, if you have personal questions or stuff from the chat that you would like to share out, or just get his response to, share, welcome.
First of all, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, both of you. Fantastic conversation. Not so much movement in the chats by way of questions, but I did want to call out, we got the Dangerous Maybe hanging out, pointing out as well how cool this discussion is. And he's a huge fan of Brian's channel, as I believe most of us are.
And I'm a huge fan of his work. I'm been very grateful for his support throughout the time I've been having this channel.
It's amazing to have this convergence of minds in one place, kind of out of nowhere for me. I do have a personal question. Probably make our man Dave roll his eyes a little bit, because I harp on this particular thinker a bit. I don't know if you're familiar with a professor out of Utah, T. Nguyen, works in aesthetics, social epistemology, and he's got a paper that I'm really interested in, Twitter, the gamification of Twitter, how Twitter gamifies communication. And I kind of wanted to get a kind of a, I don't know, your Lacanian perspective on the, impact on discourse when we have a society which largely conducts its discourse through an inherently, I don't know, a gamified medium where the true purpose of conversation seems to have been usurped by maybe optimization for likes and exposure and such. I kind of wanted to get your perspective on that.
Mm-hmm. So I had a question on one of my videos one time about ChatGPT and how I thought Lacan's notions of symbolic and imaginary relate to that. And I think I might have a similar response to this question. I'm not sure. I don't know if I can speak to gamification too much, but I can say that I mean, Twitter is a good example of the overlapping dialectical relationship between symbolic and imaginary, right? We have this algorithm that is guiding how the content is produced, and even though we think that's done sort of autonomously, and there is a degree of autonomy, Lacan speaks of the symbolic as being like a machine, right? In Seminar 2, and I think that's a good that actually applies well to the way in which the algorithm works. In fact, Lacan works through some algorithms in his in that seminar to illustrate the symbolic. But yet there is also this big other, which And the big other is, in a sense, part of the symbolic, but also has its foot in the real. And I think this is where you have people, concrete people, who are just making decisions about what data to feed the algorithm, what are some of the weights and weights is going to give certain content, and so it directs the symbolic in a certain way to structure the content. So I think that's all. So I think that's one level of thinking about Twitter on a Lacanian perspective. And then there's the imaginary content, right? Is everything that we think Twitter is about. Both in terms of the content it produces and what we get focused on and fixated on, as well as what we think Twitter is doing in its function within society and all the meanings we impute upon that. So I think those and we tend to be very fixated on the content. It's like, oh, someone let out this tweet, and we get constantly like little like dogs chasing squirrels trying to find the next bit of meaning, and getting attached to it, getting agitated. And the imaginary is a place of love and hate is where that gets expressed often, and so that's all happening on the surface level, and we miss this underlying symbolic algorithm and the big other who is sort of whose law is governing this process.
Do you think that this impacts or precludes it from being true or genuine discourse, or is this just what we must accept as our episteme, or our situation? This is discourse now. We are stuck with either gamified communication or nothing, or say algorithmically curated communication or nothing.
I would say I'm not so sure it's different. I'm not so sure it's different than how our communication has been. I think we get into sometimes we can fall into this lament of some past history where there was true discourse, and now it's been sabotaged by this technology, and I'm not quite sure. Even when I was a teenager, I always had trouble with conversation because I saw it as too superficial and so artificial, and we have these sort of predetermined ways of talking to people, and our brain, and we can even think about the brains as sort of wired toward elevating certain information and downplaying certain information like an algorithm, and then there's a whole symbolic world going on underneath. So I if anything, Twitter in my eyes makes explicit what is been the implicit expression of discourse predating the rise of social media. I'm sure there are other things we could talk about in terms of changes. So it's not exactly the same, but I actually would want to. My first move is to point out the similarities between now and then, and then maybe work from there to look at some of the differences.
Awesome, thank you.
I want to just throw in that I don't roll my eyes at you for that reason, Adam. I roll my eyes at you because you're funny looking. No, it's not that at all. It's that I want to experiment with gamification, so I'm going to. That's not to say it's not harmful. As far as I think the more important thing that Brian's getting to is that this is a part of our reality prior to its rise on Twitter, but I want to speak to your facticity, your singularity of being basically like a feral child. You are not institutionalized, right? And so the gamification of platforms that we appear on through the internet mirrors the gamification of institutionalized incentive structures that a lot of people were subjectivized into as children. right? And so that was I've been thinking a lot about that, and anyway, I just that was my thing. But Nance, you got anything?
So I trying to nail down intentionality, um, as opposed to care. Does intentionality rest on agency, or does it give rise to agency?
Hmm. I would, I guess the way I would say it's agency in relationship to what is being acted on. So it is agency, but it's always agency in relationship to something. And you can have different ways of relating to objects. I can treat someone as a commercial transaction. I can treat someone as a lover. I can treat someone as there's all, I can care for them. I can desire them. I can hate them. There's all these intentionalities that are, or intentional acts that I engage in. But it's always in relationship to a content. And so I think if you mean agent as somehow separate from the thing it's acting on, then no, I don't think that is what Husserl means by intentionality. But so long as you think of the inextricable relationship, the object for subject relationship that cannot be broken up any further, that's intentionality.
Thank you.
Hey, Andrew.
Hey Brian, how you doing?
Good to see you.
Good, good. I don't know how much I missed as far as like who asked what, but yeah, Dave mentioned in the beginning that I had a question last night during the post talk about being in time and history of the concept of time. My question was um, in relation to Heidegger, and whenever he has any criticisms of Kant, is it always within Kant's framework of a transcendental critique and transcendental idealism itself, or is it sort of the appropriation of Kant by the Marburg School, which uses Kant as not back to the not trying to get at the thing in itself, but more about the conditions of possibility of scientific knowledge and scientific experience?
Mm-hmm. I would say that it's definitely both. I think from what I'm trying to recall now, because there are critiques that Heidegger levels against Kant, and I'll try to recall them off as best I can. But um, in many ways, I would see Heidegger as agreeing with Husserl in terms of his critique of Kant. I believe that the Kant in the separation of the noumenal and the phenomenal, right? That this idea that you have to make this distinction, that's problematic. That in going back to the things themselves in phenomenology, which is something that I think Heidegger provides one of the best descriptions of in the introduction. Phenomenology is it. There's no thing behind it. And so in going back to the things themselves, we go back to the phenomena. Now, for Heidegger, this means ontology, it means hermeneutics, looking at things in those lights. But fundamentally, there is no dichotomy, and that the existentials, even though they are considered they're almost on par with Kantian a prioris, they are not internal to any subject. Heidegger wants to get rid of any notion of a transcendental subject, of a transcendental ego, whether it's the variant of Kant or the variant of Husserl, that all those are derivative of a more fundamental situation. And I think this is something I haven't talked about yet, but Kant is very much focused on sort of the intellectual processing of information, right? So affectivity is there, but it's sort of, it's not, it's, think it's relegated to the aesthetic and or sensibility, and it's not a primary existential. It's not a primary category for Kant. Whereas for Heidegger, moods are fundamental. Moods are a fundamental way of relating to the world, and that's something you don't see in Kant at all. So not that there's an explicit critique of Kant there, but I think there's an implicit one.
No, that makes sense. And I like how you pointed out mood, because I was thinking the same thing of like, or like modes of being, right? Which is like authenticity and inauthenticity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Kant doesn't do much to recognize the in the embeddedness of our being in the world. There's none of that recognition, that we start off in that and then we emerge out of that to reflect upon our possibilities. So none of those are or at least they're not explicit in Kant and as far as the critique of pure reason. I'm sure if there's a Kantian scholar, I'm sure I'm going to get something about, actually in this work he says that, but for the most part, the standard telling of Kant, and that's the one I'm going off of, lacks a lot of those features. And I really want to underscore affectivity that's one of the major contributions of Heidegger over Husserl. Husserl still preserves that sort of rationalistic dimension of knowledge that Kant had, and I think this is, to me, this is why I actually talked about the example of love and talking about how love opens up something about that's lovable in my wife that I can discover. That's, right out of Heidegger. Heidegger, the moods, even though Heidegger doesn't talk about love, he talks about moods that they're not just feelings, they're ways of opening up possibilities of existence. They're fundamental ways of opening up possibilities of existence, and that's a form of knowledge that so few thinkers had really considered up to that point. Maybe Pascal was like one of the first.
Mikey wrote an article called, oh, well, actually I should pull it up because I don't remember exactly what it's called, but The Dangerous Maybe Ben Shapiro Heidegger. Basically, it's called Facts and Feelings. Yeah, and so I'll put that up on the screen. It's called Facts and Feelings, a Heideggerian critique of Ben Shapiro, where basically, and the fact is we can give the devil his due and say, yeah, there are facts and people do have to, face up to facts sometimes. But there is an enjoyment in sharing certain facts to certain people in certain situations in certain ways, right? And the enjoyment to be had, it can be a vile one. And sometimes the Shapiro mode is definitely one of a kind of jouissance that's getting an enjoyment at another person's expense, just giving facts. But what he focuses on in this piece is moods, the fundamental orientation that we have towards the world through mood, and how it's the mood that brings those facts to light for us, right? Not just those facts to light, right, in terms of appearance, but also the way that we organize them, the way that they are structured symbolically via like our master signifier and all of these other things when we get into ideology critique. So I guess the question that I've been dying to ask you, though, and by the way, everybody else, this is your time. I'm asking a question to fill time here, but I do want you all to kind of be a part of this conversation if you want to, so you don't have to turn off your cameras or anything like that. But my question is basically about the gaze and mood and how they are related. Because to me, it seems like the only way I can make sense of Lacanian gaze is through Heideggerian mood. But if that's an analogy that is going to cause me more confusion down the road, then you should correct me right now.
Yeah. Well, the notion of a gaze is very interesting, and actually I had it written down somewhere. I was thinking about bringing it up because when we're talking about intentionality, the gaze is a unique kind of phenomenon because It's not something we have. It's not a mental content. It doesn't give itself in any way. But it's a what maybe Levinas, but definitely Jean-Luc Marion talk about as a reverse intentionality, a counter intentionality, where I become the phenomenon, the mental content of someone else's mental act. And this is a fundamental reorientation of the notion of intentionality to be on the other end of it. And so in that you see this, you see that notion in Sartre, you see this in the face in Levinas, and so that's a very go ahead.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but like I almost, are we confusing kinds of gaze here? Because I understand that the phenomenological idea of gaze, with where Sartre is talking about the person who kind of interpolates you because you feel like you're being watched when you get caught being a voyeur or whatever. That makes sense as a reverse intentionality, finding yourself as the object. But I took gaze in the Lacanian sense to be like a radical departure from that, where I'll use McGowan talking about the cinema, right? He talks about how everything that works in what is being shown to you, it actually works because it's you. It's pointing you out in like this way that like it shows you something about your unconscious and what it's seeking or something like that. But I have a really hard time articulating it, but it seems like I do think that this is supposed to be radically different from the Sartrean, Levinasian, Merleau-Pontian type of gaze. So, okay, you were already probably going to clarify this. So,
yeah, so that was sort of a parenthetical comment that I got provoked because I was thinking about this beforehand. But yeah, so I meant to transition from that parenthetical. Sorry about that. Sometimes my thoughts go tangential like that, but that's why I need a script when I talk because I often have trouble being linear in my presentation otherwise. But but then you're absolutely right. The Lacanian gaze is something very different, right? And this is, I actually, working through Žižek's The Parallax View, it's actually been very helpful for me to think about the notion of gaze, because as I'm right now, my next video is going to be on chapter 1 of The Parallax View, and he talks a lot about the subject-object relation and how and thinks about it in terms of the parallax view and the minimal difference, and the way in which the object, the sublime object, it both is other than me, but also contains something in me. There's a blind spot, there's a stain in the object that is something that is, in a sense, looking back at me, and that it is the gaze, the internal gaze. The way I understood it is sort of like we internalize like the ego ideal and the superego and all that, and that gaze that we have internalized is then discovered in the things that we see out there in the world, and that we find it looking back at us. And this is and I'm, correct me if you think that that's not representing it well, but I think that is a very that's another way of thinking about the relationship between subject object that's different. I think this is very different from the phenomenological point of view. I'd have to think about how to reconcile.
Yeah, that's I guess the connection then from Heidegger's mood, which is I think mood's like a little downstream from the fundamental term that gets translated poorly as state of mind, right? Which is like there's those three primary I don't want to call them registers, but they're kind of like registers, which is like there's state of mind, is it discourse and understanding, right? Like, and that's kind of Kantian understanding, but basically what Heidegger does in Being and Time is he takes that Kantian understanding and he puts it on an equiprimordial basis with discourse and state of mind. And so, you know, like, and then obviously, like, we have like these are like existentials. These are like existential structures of being in the world. But then, like, there's the derivative existential ontic manifestations of these things, right? And so the derivative average everyday existential of discourse is idle chatter, right? But just because you as a teenager were well aware idle chatter is annoying doesn't mean that it's useless. And more importantly, it shows us something. It shows us that there is the possibility of another kind of discourse, a higher order discourse. And so that's the kind of structure he's trying to get at. Anyway, putting those all on an equiprimordial basis is, I think, one of his greatest innovations. But so anyway, state of mind, mood, various moods as a sort of existential, ontic manifestation of the fundamental state of mind. Point being that what is revealed, what we see, is coming from that, right? But this isn't for individuals who are feeling anxious today. This is just as much for how everyone felt going through COVID. There was a feeling in the air and something that everyone was going through. Now, different people had their different existential ontic modifications of that, but the overall state of mind was a zeitgeist that people were going through, right? And so I am only unpacking this all to hopefully see to see if I'm doing a good job or not, and then finally to see. So bringing it back to gaze, my question is if it's like that's showing us something about like our libidinal economy, and it seems like mood. It's the same thing, like the things that we're caring about, the things that we're seeing, that we're dealing with. It's also telling us something about what's lighting up the world, what's at the basis of that. So that's I guess the similarity there, but yeah, it seems complicated.
I thank you for clarifying. It clicked when you were talking. I'm trying to. It seems like there's something there. I haven't actually thought about this, so it's actually a very interesting and unique idea about mood and the Lacanian gaze. And it would make sense, the connections you're making, that the way a mood sort of reveals things, discloses things to me, would parallel the way in which the gaze I encounter the gaze in the Lacanian sense. I feel like there's something doesn't sit right with me on this comparison.
Right.
And I think I think if I'm thinking from Heidegger's perspective, there's a discomfort here with because I think and perhaps my discomfort is around the notions of the subject, that Heidegger is so uncomfortable with the idea of subjectivity. He's so allergic to that term. And yet that it's hard to think about these Lacanian ideas without evoking the subject.
Good.
That we'd have to think through that part, because that is there's the idea of the unconscious too, which doesn't play the same role in Heidegger and Being in Time. So I think it's an idea worth exploring. I hadn't really considered it. I think there are some complications that would have to be worked through. So I guess that's all I could say without over talking it.
No, that's great. Yeah, Andrew.
I was gonna say, can I add on something about the gaze? Because like one thing, if there is a mood, it would probably be anxiety, if anything, with the encounter of the gaze. But I was thinking about it. It's like Samuel McCormick of Lectures on Lacan talks about how like with the gaze, because like in Seminar 1, he'll overcome like the Sartrean notion of the gaze because it falls too much in the dichotomy, or not dichotomy, but it falls too much in the imaginary register of like, as you were saying, Dave, about like being interpolated, like, oh, I'm being seen, like I'm this peeping Tom, right? Like it's not that the I see the person and the person sees me, but I see them seeing me, right? That's the sort of imaginary narcissistic relationship. With the gaze, it has to do with the real. And if there's a mood, it's an anxiety. And how the real applies is that when we look at the subject or the split subject, it is always trying to account for itself in the symbolic and imaginary dichotomy, right? In this dialectic. And we look at this in Freud's dream urban subjection, where when he looks down at her throat, he can't account for what he sees, him being the subject, the split subject. There is no mirror that has a mirroring back for an ego to instantiate an imaginary relationship. So you're left with a void, less than nothing, pretty much. And so that's where the gaze of the real is encountering, because it's like the object that stares back at you, you can't develop that mirror stage or that ego ideal. It's you're left with just pretty much for lack of a better term, the real, the void. I don't know if that helps.
I'd like to
like
hear it.
Pretty much
like
the lack. You're encountering your lack, which is just a structure without content.
So Todd in the cinema book, which is basically about gaze, talks about how when you're it's I think it's the lack in your desire specifically, right?
Yes.
Because
if desire is structured like a language, there's no content. The ego ideal to be able to kind of ground that, right? Because what is the ego but a mirroring? So the way we relate are our ego ideals, but in an encounter with your traumatic real, the trauma, it does not have. You're encountering the subject, the split subject of the unconscious encounters its own lack. There's no ego for it to identify with. And so that's what's so frightening, because it's like this empty gaze that is of your desire.
Okay. So, and I apologize for constantly bringing up Todd's book. The only reason I'm doing this right now, and obviously everybody loves Todd here, but the reason I just keep bringing it up is because I've been profoundly confused about gaze, and Mikey complicated it for me by sharing his confusion about it. And so then I read the introduction to Todd's book, and I've been confused ever since. Like I was like, but I think it's kind of through these conversations and stuff gelling a little bit for me, to where the basic idea is that as far as using Lacanian gaze for film analysis, as opposed to the feminist gaze and that kind of tradition, which obviously is the most prominent in American cinema theory, it's about, instead of just looking like, oh, see, every woman, as well as every desirable object, because women are being reduced to desirable objects, portrayed on the screen, is portrayed in such a way so as to prop up the ego of the masculine, the primarily like male viewership in this kind of superior consumer role, which is like obviously valid and a useful way of thinking about things. But this Lacanian gaze approach, which Joan Kopchak is so important for bringing into things, in I think it's in Read My Desire, right? Applied to cinema the way McGowan does it, it's like there are like four fundamental kind of categories. He draws like a grid of classification here for different kinds of movies or films. Ones that frustrate desire in a specific way, ones that try to fulfill, ones that don't, they try to ingratiate it in a certain way, but they're all, insofar as they work or whatever, like how they might work, it's gonna fill that out. And I have to read the rest of the book and then reread it and then have a real conversation with Todd. And my question about gaze was hoping for some clarification on if it has a relation to phenomenology and what that might be. I think that what we have here is like why there might be some kind of similarity, but also more importantly, why that similarity would lead us astray if we took it too seriously. And now I want to get away from Lacan and bring it right back to phenomenology and kind of let Brian close this thing out, because I know we've kept him about the length that he had agreed to. when he said he had about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So I guess I would just ask you to share any final thoughts and kind of make your plugs for your books and your channel and all of that.
Yeah, so first off, I appreciate this, Dave. I really, I'm excited to do this, to get involved in these conversations. I really like what I'm seeing here on YouTube. When I'm working on an essay that actually, in light of our conversation about that special work that you're putting together, Dave, with different authors, trying to put together an essay where I'm really reflecting on what we're doing here and what this means in light of the history of philosophy, because it's just so, I think we are really getting back to an age in which there was philosophy without schools, and that prior to the institutionalization of philosophy. So there's something really about getting back to the roots of philosophy that is happening, and think in this work that you're facilitating here. So I think everyone knows my channel is Singularity as Sublimity, and I'm not sure what else I want to plug, but I think this notion of intentionality has a lot of fruitful directions that we can consider. I think we hadn't even gotten to. I sort of alluded to it, intentionality in Levinas, Sartre, right, Merleau-Ponty, and who really takes up intentionality as comportment a great deal. I think there's a lot. I think that one way of reading the history of phenomenology is the history of interpretations of intentionality and what they do with it.
Yes.
And I think it was Paul Ricoeur who said that phenomenology is the series of heresies of Husserl, and that I think is true. It's a series of deviations from Husserl's interpretation of intentionality into all sorts of realms, all the way to Michel Henry, whose notion of flesh and materiality is an attempt to show the derivativeness of intentionality in a very different way than Heidegger did. So, and then of course the more recent phenomenologists, and Levinas would be included in sort of this group of those who've been very interested in the notion of the reverse intentionality. So, and how Levinas develops an ethics in relationship to this. So, I think there's a lot of fruitful directions to keep considering with that idea.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to future dialogue. And I really hope to see, what you're coming up with here. So,
Thank you all.
Take care.
Good to see you again, Brian. Have a good day.
Good to see you, Andrew. You too. Bye, Nance. Bye, Adam.
And now a quick message from our sponsors. Just kidding. This will be neither quick nor from any corporate or state sponsorship. What follows is a description of Theory Underground, a thank you to its patrons, information about the upcoming tour, and 3 brand new courses that you might want to enroll in. Stay for the whole thing to get promo codes to save on those courses or information about the financial aid scholarship.
Theory Underground is a philosophy lecture course gated social media site and publishing house by and for working class intellectuals and renegade academics. The subject matters dealt with at Theory Underground are the most important, yet neglected for understanding ourselves, the world, and ways of possibly changing it.
Because we have no corporate or state sponsors, only a small band of patrons, everything in this first year of operation helps immensely. Special thank yous to Bert, Nance, Marilyn, Carl, and Adam for your help in the $50 per month patron tier. If you want to help but the $50 tier is too much, consider donating towards meals and gasoline via Venmo or PayPal.
The gasoline is for our countrywide tour of the U.S., where we aim to meet with supporters of this effort and do events to draw in new people who do not necessarily belong to marketing demographics predetermined by the attention economy. We will be giving lectures, leading discussions, and promoting several brand new books. Our goal is to only go to towns and cities where we have personal invitations from at least one person. We are doing this underground style, which for the hardcore punk scene in the US meant coming for long enough to get to know the area and do multiple events, not this modern treadmill of a new city each night in an attempt to maximize fame and profit. If you are interested in being a host, guide, or volunteer, then please fill out the form at https://theory-underground.com/US-tour-2023. In an attempt to utilize the resources made publicly available, we will be using libraries for most of our events. So if you have a local library card and can reserve a space for us, we would most appreciate it. Alternatively, some of you might have access to pretty epic venue spaces. Just let us know ahead of time.
Now for the courses. The 3 upcoming courses are What is Sex?, Digital Literacy and CMT, Critical Media Theory, and Being and Time. All courses at Theory Underground are available after the fact on demand, but some people get a lot more out of doing it live with a cohort.
If you are looking to think deeply about the devices we have become reliant on while experimenting with new ways of reclaiming your attention span and relationship with yourself and others, then check out Digital Literacy and Critical Media Theory, a course that is structured to combat the attention economy while strategically using some of its tools to help us gain a freer relationship to our devices. If interested, an introduction to this course will be shared at the end of this video. Just make sure to click on it. The lectures for this course take place on the second Sunday of every month for 6 months, starting in May. If you sign up at Tier 3, you also get access to the recovery group component, which also meets once per month. Enroll with promo code CMTEarlyBirdYT before May 13th for 20% off.
If you are frustrated by the discourse revolving around gender ideology, left and right, then join us in thinking deeper about sex. Cadell Last of Philosophy Portal is joining up with Theory Underground to teach Alenka Zupančic's What is Sex?, one of the most succinct and cutting-edge works of theory dealing with the topic. Zupančič is one of the Slovenian circle's most incisive critics of both naive progressivism and reactionary tendencies when it comes to thinking about the relationship between sex, culture, and subjectivity. If interested, watch 3 Reasons to Read What is Sex?, which will be shared on screen at the end of this video. What is Sex begins in May and goes through June, meeting for 4 lecture sessions, and, surprise, you will actually get to meet Alenka Zupančič herself. Use promo code WHATISSEXEarlyBirdYT before May 7th for 20% off.
And just so you know, everybody, don't stress the capitalization. I just make it that way so it's more readable. It's not case sensitive. Being in Time is one of the most notorious, profound, and difficult works of philosophy from the last 200 years. Its deconstruction of modernity and fundamental challenge to scientism is a prerequisite rite of passage for any thinker who wants to seriously engage with continental philosophy, social theory, or world change. In this course, you will learn about what Heidegger means by being in the world, Dasein, being unto death, and so many other crucial developments. But more important than all these buzzwords is just taking on this work itself and wrestling with the text. Doing so will rapidly accelerate your reading comprehension abilities and simultaneously challenge some of your most deep-seated presuppositions. As before, an introductory video to this course is shared on the end screen of this video, or can be accessed from the links in the description. Being in Time Division 1 starts in June and ends July 22nd. Division 2 begins August 19th and goes through October. To sign up for Division 1 today, use the promo code BEINGINTIME before the end of May for 20% off.
If you feel obstructed by the cost of these courses, then we have good news. But before getting into the financial aid info, why are there even price tags at all, much less tiered pricing? First, because some people just want to audit, whereas others want constructive critical feedback or even one-on-one sessions. The tiers exist so that you can get the value you are seeking while compensating me, Dave, fairly for the time and energy required.
Second, the prices set for these courses aim to make Theory Underground sustainable. meaning that it will bring in enough to pay for the costs of the operation, including my personal bills, since I want to be a co-earner in the household when my soon-to-be wife and I start a family.
Thirdly, people tend to take the things they pay for more seriously, and we want you to get the most out of this experience.
With those reasons aside, we do not seek to exclude anyone who is struggling just to get by. We have a financial aid scholarship option for people who are currently between jobs or who live in a country on a cheap currency, like many of you who watch from Thailand, India, Mexico, or Poland, to name a few of the residents of some of the people who have already received financial aid scholarships in the last couple of months. Because I know what trying to study theory under the stresses of housing insecurity and poverty is like, the scholarship was set up during the first month of operation. Simply fill it out at https://theory-underground.com/scholarship.
Last but not least, stay tuned for the Theory Underground app, coming soon to an app store near you on your phone.
Yeah, and seriously, thank you for listening or watching to this point, and yeah,
Thanks.
we look forward to taking these courses with you.
Bye.